Okay, so a little bit about the life cycle of cattle worms. So most of the worms that we deal with in cattle, they have to be on pasture. If I take a calf and I put him up in a stall, or a cow or whatever, if I put an animal in a stall and there's no forage out there, then he's not going to pass worms, right? Because basically what happens is the worm is passed out onto the soil, then the worm, the egg kind of stays there, then it kind of develops to a larva eventually, and then when the moisture gets right and the temperature gets right for that parasite, then it starts to develop, and if the moisture's right, then it'll kind of move up the plant, then the animal ingests it as he's eating, and the whole process starts over again. Okay, so as we was talking about resistant parasites a while ago, if I've got an animal that's got resistant eggs, resistant parasites, and all these eggs are on my pasture, what happens when my cattle, the cattle that were on the pasture before my normal cattle, in other words, if I infect a pasture, then pretty soon the cattle that I wasn't having any issues with are going to start picking up these resistant worms. So now again, we're probably going to have a few of those resistant worms out, because where do the worms actually mate? And that's in the animal, right? So what we want to do is to try to keep as much as possible the parasites that's in our pasture susceptible to the dewormer we're using. Now again, parasites on the pasture are just like flies or everything else. Do all the flies ever leave? No. Do all the parasites on the pasture leave? No. So we're trying to control them the best we can. Okay? So this is a slide, again, Dr. Craig loaned me, and we're talking, and this is just looking at Osteotagia, the brown stomach worm. And so we're looking at, this first one is we had a hot, dry summer, and then we had a mild winter. So what happened to the level on pasture during that hot, dry summer? They went away. Then the winter came back up, because Osteotagia is a cool season parasite. Now some of these others, again, different life cycles, warm or whatever, but this is the one that probably costs us the most money, so we're focusing on that one. Okay, so if we had a warm summer and then we had a harsh winter, we're kind of seeing a different deal, because the summer wasn't as hot. So again, kind of like we talked about BVD, that bug's got to stay in nature. It has to have a PI animal. Okay, the way worms stay in nature is in the spring, they sense that it's fixing to get hot, right? So down in our part of the world, the brown stomach worm does not like it being real hot out here. In fact, when you get on south, kind of the lines around Victoria down onto South Texas, we don't see this worm because it's too hot down there for it. But in this country, and as we go on north, it's certainly not uncommon at all. So what happens is that worm senses along in about May or whenever it's fixing to warm up. And so basically that worm insists, and the proper term is hypobiosis, but I like to say it hibernates. So that worm kind of drills into the abomasum and it lives there. Okay. Now, until the last few years, or I say the last 20 years, probably 30 years, we've developed better wormers, some of our injectable wormers, that can actually get that encysted stage of that parasite up, and even with white wormers, if you use them in a proper way, repeated deals. The point is, you want to use a dewormer, strategic dewormer, along in the spring, and usually in about May, worm these cattle, because you're going to get these encysted larvae. Because what happens is they stay there, because if you notice in Dr. Craig's slide, in the summer we don't have worms on the pasture because they dry out, they die. But what happens is they live in that calf through the summer, encysted in the abomasum. Then we get into winter, the fall, and it starts cooling down. They know, so what happens is they start coming out of their cyst, they start mating again, they start infecting the pasture again, and that's what these graphs are showing. So when to worm the cattle is very important, is to understanding how the process works. Usually with calves, we want to deworm these calves because they picked up these worms in the spring on grass, right? Now the other thing, do I need to worm a month-old calf? Probably not. Where did these calves get the worms? Again, on the forage. So usually we say about 2 months of age. If you worm a calf under 2 months of age, you're probably not getting much return. But again, worm them before it starts to get hot, so they're going to flush out, they're going to kill a lot, so they're not going to contaminate your winter pasture as much. And then as we go through the summer, these calves are going to do better. Because what do these worms do? Basically, what the worm does, I said it insists in the abomasum. That's the true stomach of a ruminant, correct? So it would be like if somebody had 1,000 pinholes in our stomach. Would you want to eat if you've got ulcers? No, your appetite's depressed. So basically you get swelling of this abomasum, you get more likely to get other bacteria, other infections in the stomach. But the real thing is the real impact is these animals don't eat as much, and if they don't eat as much, you depress their immune function. So again, a good deworming program is very important. Okay, let's talk a little bit about liver flukes. Liver flukes, again, like a clay soil, they like a non-acidic soil. They like it swampy. And I hope I didn't say that backwards a while ago. Moving water, they like a little moving water like irrigation. They like a left-handed snail. There's a particular snail that carries this. And then they need herbage, but they need vegetation in the water, okay? So basically the economics of the flukes is a lot of liver disease. Of course, if you've got these things migrating through the liver, you're obviously going to get weight loss, you're going to develop anemia. In other words, they're not going to have as much blood, you're going to lose feed efficiency. You can have some reproductive issues because the liver has a part in producing hormones, correct? So you're going to have some reproductive issues in your females, and then also when you slaughter these animals, you're going to have more condemned livers. And as we talked a while ago, Clostridium hemolyticum is very, very, very important if you have a risk for flukes to kind of keep them from dying of liver disease, Clostridium hemolyticum getting in the liver and causing them death. Okay, so here's a map of Texas kind of showing where most of the flukes are. And I always get a little worried about this because this is just in generalities. Again, I practiced in West Texas, up in Haskell County, so it's kind of in rolling plains of Texas. You don't see that in that map, but again, I had heard that this was really an economic problem. Had a real good friend that practiced over in Dickens County, same way. So again, don't rule out just because I live in this area or that area that liver flukes are not an issue. Okay, so there's different kinds of flukes, right? We have the magna, which is the deer fluke. The difference between the deer fluke and hepatica, which is the cattle fluke, is they both can cause liver disease. But the difference with the deer fluke is they don't compete. In other words, the cattle don't compete in their life cycle. They're put in the pasture with deer and elk. So basically, what's going to happen with that, to control it, you can't control it on the pasture with deworming and stuff like you can with the cattle fluke. So again, very hard to control. There's a little bit of argument on how effective the drugs are for controlling the deer fluke. But again, you have both of those flukes, and treating cattle is not effective on treating the pasture like it would be treating for hepatica, which is the cow fluke. Hepatica, again, cattle are able to pass the eggs and contaminate the pasture. They don't do that with the deer fluke. And they infect the snails. The snails require about a month or longer to hatch, 1 or 2 months to develop in the snail, and then Metasicaria, this is a little developing bug, gets on the vegetation in the water, stays there for a little while, then along come cattle, they ingest the larva, then it enters the liver and into the bile ducts, matures, lays more eggs, and then here we go again. Treatment, not effective for the deer fluke. Some people say albendazole, which is valbazen, at 1.5 times the dose. Drugs are not effective on the migrating liver fluke. We have to remember that. So the only thing we can do is kill the adult once it gets in the bile duct. Usually in the fall, minimize pasture contamination and infection of the snail. So to minimize the pasture contamination is one of the big reasons we want to treat. Okay, due to snails being more prevalent in cool weather, deworming is most effective if you do it in November or December to protect the snail infection of your pastures as it gets cool. Albendazole or ivermectin with ivermectin plus are probably the only dewormers that are effective. And don't forget about the red water vaccine. Okay, there's a couple of pictures that's showing hepatica, so that's, you can see what damage that does to the liver. These are livers that actually had fasciola hepatica, which is the top one. That's the liver, that's not the deer fluke, that's actually the cattle fluke. And then that's what the deer fluke will do to the liver. So you can see they do a heck of a job on those livers.